Okay, I'm pretty sure at this point all of you have heard of a little animated movie called K-pop Demon Hunters. A movie that honestly feels like it just came from out of nowhere and took the world by storm, as its massive success has led to the movie being projected to become Netflix's most watched animated film of all time, a legion of fans online flooding the internet with K-pop Demon Hunter content, and a soundtrack so good that it's breaking real-life records, topping some of the biggest talent in the K-pop industry. And the craziest part about it is, from the outside looking in, it might seem like the success of K-pop Demon Hunter was just by luck. It dropped on a random day and managed to capture the attention of millions. But if you've been paying attention to the animation industry, it's actually a lot deeper than that. Because K-pop Demon Hunters is just one of the many films that Sony Pictures Animation has released over the last couple years that has not only managed to resonate with audiences, capturing the hearts of millions, but also redefine what people want to see out of animation. Which honestly sounds crazy to say, because only a couple years ago, depending on who you asked, at best Sony was just an inconsistent animation studio, and at worst one of the least respected studios in the industry. But fast forward to the current day, and Sony's not just a trailblazer in the industry, they're trendsetters. And with what seems to be the fall of Pixar and DreamWorks not being where they once were, I wholeheartedly believe that we are getting ready to see Sony cement themselves as the best animation studio around. But okay, wait, time out. Cause how did we even get here? Because one look at Sony's catalog and it's easy for anyone to see that they've had an interesting history, to say the least. Remember how I said at one point in time the best you could call Sony was an inconsistent animation studio? Well, I honestly feel like that was one of the fairest labels to give them, because they weren't inconsistent in a way that they weren't putting out movies, but the quality of movies that they were putting out genuinely amazes me looking back on it. Because Sony would legitimately go from releasing a film that would be universally agreed upon as being pretty mid, and then drop a movie out of nowhere that would be so good that you would look at yourself afterwards and think there is no way that these two movies were made by the same studio. And this wasn't some pattern that the studio developed over time, this was something that people noticed from the very beginning. All we have to do is take a look back at Sony's first couple of movies. In 2006, they would release their first film, Open Season, and the general opinions around this film all kind of fall in the same range, anywhere from, I mean, it's alright, to, yeah, this movie kind of sucks. Now what's crazy is I actually remember having this movie on DVD as a kid and used to watch it pretty often when I was bored, and I really didn't know there were so many people that actually hate this film until I started researching for this video. Do I think it deserves all the hate that I've seen online? Not really. From what I remember, it was just kind of a generic, bland film. But I can say, out of all the films that I watched growing up, this movie does not come to mind when I think of some of the best ones that I was watching in 2006. But okay, Sony made an alright at best film that ended up being pretty profitable at the box office. The film wasn't so bad that anybody was writing them off, but it also wasn't good enough for anyone to be saying that they're the next Pixar. Expectations were pretty low. So you can imagine the surprise when they released their second film, Surf's Up, and it was met with widespread love across the board. There were so many things that made Surf's Up such a good movie. For 2007, this movie looks so good, and I honestly say that the animation holds up to this day. The CGI work that Sony put into the water made for some of the most breathtaking shots you would have seen in an animated movie at the time. Not to mention, the concept was just so unique, using a documentary style structure with interviews and just up close camera moments. It just gave the movie a completely different feeling from a lot of things that were out at the time. And the hard work that they put into this film wouldn't go unnoticed, as it would not only gross 152 million worldwide, but it would also get an Oscar nomination for Best Animated Feature Film. And this is what I mean when I say Sony was an inconsistent studio, because how do we go from Open Season, which like I said was an okay movie but nothing generational, to Oscar nominated Surf's Up only 1 year later? Well, it goes back to exactly what I just said. Inconsistency. You see, even though Sony had made Open Season and Surf's Up, unless you were really checking to see who produced these films, you wouldn't have even known it, because neither one of these films had a consistent style. Both films felt like they were individuals. They felt like they didn't have anything in common. Hell, I told y'all earlier that I had Open Season on DVD, but I also had Surf's Up because for some reason I had all the Sony movies. And honestly, I didn't even know that these two movies were made by the same studio until years later, because that's how different they were from one another. With Surf's Up, it didn't feel like the studio was trying to take the good aspects of Open Season and tweak them to try to make some type of formula. Rather, it felt like they had did everything they wanted to do with their first movie, and now they were ready to experiment and try different things with their second one. And this willingness to try something new led to something good, something that made people say, hey, maybe this studio can produce quality content. And what we would see going forward is that this lack of a formula would lead to some of the biggest successes under the Sony animation brand. Because because only 2 years later, Sony would release one of their most successful movies in the history of the studio, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. If Surf's Up showed that Sony wasn't afraid of changing things up, then Cloudy proved that they were willing to go all in on that concept. This movie wasn't just a visual spectacle when it first released, it was a bold declaration of the studio's identity. The movie leaned into exaggerated cartoony animation that felt fresh and dynamic, embracing squash and stretch in a way that was rarely done with CGI at the time. Directors Phil Lord and Chris Miller infused the film with absurd, rapid-fire humor that appealed to not only kids but also adults. I mean, I still remember going to see this film in theaters when it first came out with my parents, and even though I loved the movie, surprisingly, it was my dad's favorite movie of the year. The film wasn't afraid to be weird, it was self-aware, and honestly, it was just silly in the best way possible. Honestly, I think one of the only negatives I have about this film is that I just get extremely hungry while watching it. And like I spoke on a little bit earlier, it had broad audience appeal. Visual energy that could keep kids locked in, but also packed with clever jokes, heart, and wit that could hook older audiences. So it's really no surprise that the film went on to become a box office success, grossing $243 million worldwide. And after Cloudy, over the next couple years, you would just see Sony work on different animated films that, if I'm being honest, were all received pretty well. There was Arthur's Christmas, a heartwarming holiday film that Sony did in collaboration with Aardman, the studio behind Wallace and Gromit, which, you know, if you want to be fair, I don't know if you actually want to call that a Sony movie in comparison to the other ones I've been talking about in this video, but hey, they got it on their website, so I'm gonna count it anyway. But this movie has genuinely good reviews, and quite literally anyone that I've ever heard talk about it has only spoke positively about it. I didn't get to watch it when it was in theaters, but I did see it on streaming, and I can say it was a great blend of innovation, humor, and heart. I've heard some people say that this is their favorite Christmas movie of all time, and if I'm being honest, I can kinda see why. And even though it didn't perform amazing in the US box office, it made up for it internationally, especially in the UK. Then they also did another collaboration with Aardman for The Pirates, the Band of Misfits. Once again, another film that was received well critically and financially. And Sony would also go on to release one of their more well-known properties, Hotel Transylvania. I thought the premise was interesting enough to stay interested in the film. I've heard a lot of people say over the years that they feel like Sony really ramped up the wackiness when it came to this film, but I don't feel like it was anything too different from Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. And overall, it was just another good Sony film that I feel like could really appeal to all ages. This was another Sony film that I went saw in theaters with my parents, and it felt like at times they liked the film more than I did. And on top of just being a film with solid reviews, this film went on to become a breakout hit for the studio. With a budget of $85 million, Hotel Transylvania went on to make $358 million worldwide, making it Sony's biggest September opening ever. But even though the studio was putting out projects that were getting praised critically and financially, that doesn't mean everything was going well. Because like we all know at this point, Sony's key to success so far was inconsistency. They didn't have a set formula, so they were willing to try and do everything. But that doesn't mean that everything worked. Because while every once in a while you'll have an underrated gem in Sony's catalog like a Surf's Up or an Arthur's Christmas, majority of the time Sony's catalog was full of movies that would perform financially well, but on the back end were tanking with critics. For starters, out of 23 Sony films released to this date, only 14 of them are original films. The other 9 are continuations or sequels of their own IPs. Which, you know, at first doesn't sound like a bad thing. I mean, if you have something that people like, it makes sense to give them more of it. That is until you realize the constant pattern throughout Sony's history that almost every single sequel or continuation film that they have ever put out is universally agreed upon to be significantly worse than the original. Something that kind of blows my mind is that they started dipping their toes into sequels way back in the beginning after the release of Surf's Up with Open Season 2. I don't know what's more shocking, the fact that Open Season got a sequel before Surf's Up, or the fact that Open Season got a sequel at all, because who was asking for that movie? Funny enough, I actually remember watching this film. It didn't get a theater release, it went straight to DVD, and I went to Blockbuster with my dad one time, and he was strolling down the kids movie section and decided to rent not only Open Season 2 for me to watch, but Open Season 3. Can anyone please tell me how this movie got a third film? I was literally forced against my will to watch the second and third one. Who was requesting these films? I don't remember much about either one of these films, but the one thing that I can remember is is thinking to myself that the drop off in quality from the first movie was so apparent. And mind you, I was just a little kid at this point with no taste and no ability to analyze media, so that should tell you how bad these two movies were. But after the open season trilogy, Sony wouldn't actually try putting out another sequel until 2013 with The Smurfs 2, the sequel to their 2011 box office success. Now, the reason why I didn't talk about The Smurfs even though it came out in between Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs and Arthur's Christmas is because even though it was a box office success, the reviews around the movie were really mixed. While movies like Cloudy, Arthur, and even Hotel Transylvania at times got praised for being some of the best things that Sony had put out at that era, The Smurfs were not in that conversation. Many people criticized the film for having an over-reliance on pop culture and product placement, as well as forcing a modern setting, moving the Smurfs from their forest to modern-day New York. And when it came to the plot, a lot of people viewed it as not only thin, but generic at best. But the movie honestly made so much money that I can't even blame Sony for wanting to make a sequel, because over 500 million is insane. And when The Smurfs 2 released in theaters, it made a lot of money for Sony again. Maybe not as much as the first movie, but just 200 million shy. But once again, Sony was in another situation where they made a film that made a lot of money, but critically was not performing well. And all the same criticisms that people had about the first Smurf movie only amplified with the second one, with people saying that it lacked creativity, it had flat humor, and for some reason even more product placement. But honestly, if this was just a one-time thing, I don't think anyone would have really cared. I think a lot of people wouldn't have gave Sony the bad reputation that it had at one point in time. Unfortunately, things were going to get a lot worse before they got better, because for the next 4 years from 2013 to 2017, Sony was putting out nothing but sequels and continuations. Their next film was Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs 2, and while I think it was one of the better sequels in their catalog, it was still a step down from the first movie. The spark that was in the first film that made it feel so innovative and a standout of their catalog just wasn't there for the sequel, and by the end of it, I was just left feeling kind of unsatisfied. Then after that, we got Hotel Transylvania 2, which kind of left a lot of people just saying, I mean, it's okay. Nobody really hated this film, but nobody actually really praised it either. It was just kind of widely viewed as a safe, family-friendly film. But ironically, I have seen some people say that they enjoyed this film more than the first one, so hey, maybe that is one positive. Then the next film after this, and I kid you not when I say this, Open Season Scared Silly, another direct-to-video open season film. I didn't look up who the creators of Open Season were, but I can only imagine that they have serious blackmail on this studio, because how is Open Season the longest running animated franchise in Sony animation history? Oh, and remember how I asked earlier, how did Open Season get a sequel before Surf's Up? Well, I probably should have just wished for it to be a one and done, because in 2016 we got Surf's Up Wave Mania, a collaboration film with WWE. You really just can't make this stuff up. Then we got The Smurfs: The Lost Village, and look, even though the reception to this movie was bad, at least it's animated, so it's already better than the first two Smurfs movies to me. But if you thought things couldn't get any more draining when it came to Sony releases, in 2017, for their first original movie in almost 4 years, they released the Emoji Movie. I don't really feel like I need to talk about everything wrong with the Emoji Movie, mainly because there's already a video with 17 million views that does that for me. But what I will say is that this movie was the straw that broke the camel's back for a lot of people for how they viewed Sony as an animation studio. Because at one point in time, they were the studio that maybe didn't have an in-house formula, but they were taking risks, trying new things, and it was actually working out for them. But from 2013 to 2017, they did the exact opposite, relying on nothing but sequels and prequels. And then their first original film in years felt like a cheap idea with the sole intention of being trendy to kids. And the thing that frustrated a lot of people was, it wasn't like Sony wasn't a good animation studio. It was very clear to everyone that they had the tools to create something great. But for whatever reason, they just weren't doing that. So this narrative started to build up around the company that, hey, can they make something that looks nice? Are they good at animation? Absolutely. But when it comes to taking risks, writing stories with long-lasting impact, having creative ideas, are they willing to do it? No. And that narrative would stick around for a little bit until December 14, 2018, when one movie not only changed the perception of Sony, but changed the entire animation industry.
Okay, let's do this one last time, yeah? For real this time. This is it. My name is Miles Morales. I was bitten by a radioactive spider, and for like 2 days, I've been the one and only Spider-Man.
It's kind of hard to put into words just how impactful the release of Sony's Into the Spider-Verse actually was. This wasn't just a good animated film that was released this year. For a lot of people, this was the film that made them fall in love with animation or rekindle their love for animation. I could talk for days and days about how good the writing was, how impactful some of the scenes were, but honestly, it feels like we get a new video essay doing that every month. There are very few animated films that I would call a masterpiece, but when I think of this movie, that's just the only word that comes to mind. What Sony did with this film was nothing short of groundbreaking at the time, because for years, a lot of major animation studios like Pixar were building up a catalog off of movies with animation that was looking more and more realistic. But for Into the Spider-Verse, Sony did the complete opposite, using a mix of hand-drawn art and CGI that made the movie look like a real-life comic book panel coming to life. And you could literally pause any frame of the movie and just be blessed with some of the most jaw-dropping visuals that you would ever see in animation. Mix in the iconic soundtrack and legendary scenes. I mean, still to this day, Miles' leap of faith is one of my favorite moments I've ever watched in any movie, and it's no wonder why this movie took the world by storm. And what's funny enough is that the movie that people were calling a masterpiece, one of the greatest animated movies of all time, one of my top 10 favorite animated films of all time, was made by the same studio who only a year prior made the Emoji Movie. But honestly, it goes back to that very thing that we were talking about that gave Sony so much success in the beginning of the studio's life, the willingness to try something new. Because if we're all being honest here, when presented with the idea of making an animated Spider-Man film, they could have took the safe route. They could have just made another film about Peter Parker. I mean, it literally would have printed money regardless. It's literally Spider-Man. But the thing is, they didn't want to do that. When speaking on the topic, the co-producer of Spider-Verse went on to say, "Why make another Spider-Man movie?" Then I read the treatment and I was like, oh, it's Miles, fantastic. But that was the impetus. We have to make something different enough. There's a standardized sort of system in feature animation. That was definitely the task. Let's make something different. Well, mission accomplished, because not only was Into the Spider-Verse a box office success, but it was being critically praised, winning award after award. But the real reward came after the fact, because for the first time in the studio's history, Sony wasn't just another animation studio, they were the trendsetters. You started to see after Into the Spider-Verse all these other studios trying to implement the style that Sony made so famous. DreamWorks used it in 2022 with Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, with director Joel Crawford crediting Spider-Verse as direct inspiration. Nickelodeon used it in 2023 with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Mutant Mayhem, with the film producers going on to say that Spider-Verse was a trailblazer for pushing animation out of the CGI sameness. And even the Big Mouse had some subtle influence, even though there was no open credit. To everybody's surprise, Spider-Verse had made Sony a trendsetter, and with this newfound hype, they were not taking their foot off the gas. The next film they released was Angry Birds 2, and look, I know what you're thinking, but no, it's not the same as the other sequels. They didn't even make the first movie. They just had the rights to make the second one, and surprisingly, majority of people agree that this was a pretty solid film. Then their next release is honestly one of my personal favorites out of their entire catalog, the heavily underrated The Mitchells vs. the Machines. Lovable characters, great story, back again with that 2D CGI hybrid art style. And I know I said this film was underrated, but it was the top film on Netflix for a while, but I just feel like people do not talk about this film as much as they should, because this is honestly amazing. Like, if you haven't seen it, you need to watch it. Sony also released some other films around this time that, while weren't considered groundbreaking, were well received. It seemed like Sony had finally hit a spot where the films that they were making weren't just financially successful, but they were also getting good critical reception. And most importantly, they were still experimenting, still trying new things. And if we add in the success of Across the Spider-Verse, the sequel film to Into the Spider-Verse, the body of work that Sony put out from 2017 to the current day completely changed their perception. They were no longer just that studio with a couple hidden gems, they were industry elites. But now that they have this new perception, how do they stack up against some of the biggest animation studios in Western animation? Well, we might have just found out. It's no secret that the name Pixar doesn't hold the same weight that it did 10 years ago. A studio that at one point in time could sell out a movie by name alone is now reporting every year that a new animated original film isn't performing well. And with their newest film, Elio, having one of the worst debuts in the history of the company, it almost makes you think that a turning of the guard may be coming. Because while Pixar is screaming that nobody wants to watch original content anymore, Sony quietly dropped a movie that took everybody by storm. There are so many reasons why K-pop K-pop Demon Hunter shouldn't have worked. I mean, it's a film based on a niche genre of music, it had very little promo before it released, and by Pixar's logic, it's an original story. But despite the reasons why this film shouldn't have worked, it did, and it worked well, as the film went on to become a global sensation, getting over 33 million views in just 2 weeks. And look, I could praise this movie from sun up to sundown. At this point, y'all already know I'm a big fan of it. But if there's one big takeaway as to why K-pop Demon Hunter went on to become as successful as it did, and why Pixar's Elio didn't perform as well as it could have, I think it comes down to one word: freedom. Throughout this entire video, I've talked over and over about how Sony has been inconsistent as a studio throughout its entire life. And at times that inconsistency might have seemed like a bad thing, a couple good movies and a sea of mediocre ones, but that inconsistency was always tied to freedom. The freedom to try something new, the freedom to experiment, the freedom to not hold a project back because there was some in-house formula. And while at times that freedom might have gave the studio something mediocre, it also gave them something that went on to shape the landscape of animation. And that same freedom that they applied to their projects is the very reason why K-pop Demon Hunter came out the way that it did. The directors went on to say that Spider-Verse inspired them to want to make something different, but not make something similar to the Spider-Verse movies. And when presenting the idea to Sony, they loved the concept because they didn't want to do the same thing twice either. And this is exactly why I believe that Sony Pictures Animations will be at the top of the industry, because in an industry where artists are being restricted, companies want to play it safe, especially when it comes to animation. Sony is out here experimenting. They're out here taking risks. They are giving artists the freedom to actually make art, innovate, try new things. Now, does that mean that everything they put out is going to be a masterpiece? Of course not. There's going to be highs and there's going to be lows. But hey, I'd like to think I speak for most animation fans in saying that if we get 2 emoji movies for a Spider-Verse or a K-pop Demon Hunter every 2 to 3 years, I think that's a pretty fair trade. But I am extremely tired and this video ended up being way longer than I wanted it to be, so if you made it to the end, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and until then, it's been your boy Corin, and I'm off this.